Okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome, folks, to the Islamic Courses session titled Securitisation, Fundamental British Values and the Neutralizations of Dissent within Muslim Discourses in the UK, and a book review discussion on Muslim identity, politics, Islam, and activism. Very honoured and privileged to have the author, Dr. Khadijah Elshayyal, who's a visiting fellow at the Alwaleed Centre, specialising in British Muslim identity, politics, and representation at the University of Edinburgh. And it's hosted by Dr. Hira Amin, who's at the College of Islamic Studies at the Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. Before I hand it over to Dr. Hira, just a reminder to everyone, it is being recorded. Please keep your tablets or PCs or phones on mute, if not already done so. If you're not registered, leave your email address if you want to receive a link to the copy of the session. There is a Q&A session as well. You'll get a chance to please write your questions on the chat, and we'll try and get these questions. And you can also ask directly to the author. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Amin, who's going to chair the session. Dr. Amin, assalamu alaikum.
Okay, assalamu alaikum, bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I would like to welcome you all to our Zoom session today, where we'll be discussing Dr. Khadijah Elshayyal's brilliant book, Muslim Identity, Politics, Islam, Activism and Equality in Britain, published in 2018 with IB Tauris. And for those in the field of British Muslim studies, Khadijah needs no introduction, but just a quick bio for those who are maybe not familiar. Khadijah completed her PhD at Royal Holloway and subsequently completed postdoctoral and teaching fellowships at the University of Edinburgh. She has just finished her research fellowship at the Alwaleed Centre for the Centre of Study of Islam in the Contemporary World. And from this September, I'm very excited to announce that she'll be joining myself at the team and the team at the College of Islamic Studies in Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha, Qatar. So we're all very excited to have Khadijah on board. So Khadijah, thank you so much for taking your time out today. And thank you, Mizan, for organizing this. And thank you for the viewers for tuning in. So firstly, I'd like to start a bit more about yourself, Khadijah, how this project began, what interested you first in this topic, and what led you to this specific area and focus.
Yeah, firstly, thank you so much, Hira, for that lovely introduction. I'm really pleased to actually be having this conversation with you specifically, Hira. I mean, we go back quite a way back, and it's as an expert yourself on British Islam, it's just really enriching and really exciting to be having this conversation with you. So thank you for making the time, and also thank you to Mizan and Islamic Courses for putting this together. It's a real privilege to be able to speak with everybody. So about myself, in terms of my background and why I got interested in Muslim identity politics, well, it's quite a personal, I guess, story in the sense that so this is a study of British Islam and British Muslim activism, and I am a British Muslim, so I'm a product of British Muslim communities. So it's I'm writing about things that that shaped me and formed who I am in some ways. And so when I started my, I guess when I started my undergraduate studies, it was I started university just a couple of weeks after 9/11, and 9/11. You know, I was very conscious of my Muslim identity prior to that, but I guess coming of age and really sort of developing my own sort of independent interests and sort of agency as a student in that time, it really sort of it played a huge role, I think, in my interests and the kind of things I was that drew my attention, I guess, and my preoccupations. I went to university to study history, and I very consciously chose a course that wouldn't box me into sort of, I was very conscious of being sort of seen as a Muslim, and I didn't want to be studying the typical sort of Muslim type of subjects. And so I always talk about how, for instance, I declined an offer from ZOAS, for instance, to study, like, where I could have studied Middle Eastern history and Islamic history, and I studied instead at King's College London, which was a university with a Christian foundation, where I had to focus on sort of medieval European history, and then.
Were you the only Muslim in that course, or?
I think
or only
in
hijabi?
my cohort, for sure. Yes, I think there were a couple of older Muslims. Or Muslims who were older than me, if that makes sense, in like second and third years when I was there. But yeah, you could count them on one hand. There were not many at all. It's changed a fair bit since, but it definitely felt like I wanted to go out of my comfort zone. I didn't want to be doing that sort of typical thing that people would expect of me. And I think during those 3 years of my undergraduate study, I think I ended up questioning a lot about sort of my own interests and my own preoccupations because of 9/11, because of what was happening, and also because I was because activism was something I was engaged in a very big way as well, and I was exposed to it a lot. It was a time there was a lot of sort of political upheaval, and so yeah, I think the further I went into my studies, the more I realized that actually there's no running away from this issue. There's no running away from sort of studying and trying to understand a lot more about how we got where we are as Muslim communities in Britain. And so it was kind of a gradual realization, but yeah, that's it in a nutshell, I think.
Is your family from an activist background?
Right. So my family background was very consciously sort of committed to our faith, and yes, my parents and my siblings were all sort of involved in community work in various ways, and that again, of course, that shaped who I am. That shaped my sort of not just my interests, but also my sort of reservoir of knowledge and experience that I could draw upon. And I think that was something that really I felt not only was advantageous, but also something of a responsibility. So in preparing and carrying out fieldwork, I was very aware of my privilege of having sort of access to certain individuals, maybe, or spaces due to my connections. But also I felt that I had a duty to sort of be fair and critical in representing them as well. And I felt that, I mean, this was quite a frustrating time where there's a lot of misrepresentation. I think in my book I talk about this a lot. There's a lot of misrepresentation of individuals, of histories, and of associations. A lot of Muslim activist groups and tendencies were treated with very lazy approaches in terms of their representation in the media and in academia and in government and policy. And so I felt that I had a responsibility as somebody who had more of a nuanced exposure to the good, the bad, and the ugly of all of these things, to sort of really dig into that and allow it to have exposure and allow people to see that. So that was something that also motivated me.
Yeah. Were people willing to speak to you openly? Because one of the things that you discuss very well in your book is how in the securitization climate, there's a real fear. And it's a real fear as well, that they could lose their jobs, they could be under state scrutiny. And like you said, Muslims are one of the only faith groups that have this amount of scrutiny, this amount of spotlight on them. And people are really feeling this. So when you were in your fieldwork, did you have a sense of people were unwilling to speak or a bit reticent to air their views?
Yeah,
I definitely had that.
Yeah, sorry, say that again.
I definitely had that.
Yeah, no, I can relate to that for sure. I think there definitely was that, and I think I found it quite interesting. I mean, I wasn't blown away by it, because we know that this is the climate that people work under, especially people who are at the forefront of activism, which is the area we're looking at, people in the public eye, people who are constantly scrutinized, whether, as I say, in the press or by politicians, name-checked by politicians in the House of Parliament, for instance, very intense. But also that they're representing communities who we describe in our literature as suspect communities, so communities that bear the brunt of securitization policy, things like stop and search, things like Schedule 7 at port, things like the prevent duty. So they are representing people who are already sort of beleaguered with this sort of shadow of suspicion. So there is a lot feeding into that feeling, and I completely empathize with it. But I think one thing that I was a bit that made me stop and think was also to come back to my own background, is that I was a known quantity to some of these people that I was speaking with. They knew me, they knew who I was. My name was familiar, we might have met previously in other situations, but there was still a reticence, and there was still people sort of wanting to check and double check what they've said to me, and actually no, can we make that off the record now? And I completely understand that, and I'm not it's not something that I would ever dare to sort of disparage or underestimate. But it was quite an indictment, really, of the situation, I think.
So I think we should now move on to your book. And for those of you who have not had the opportunity to read it, the reason why Khadijah's book is such an important contribution to the field of British Muslim studies is because it is the first book that it meticulously traces the legislation and the policy making regarding specific in relation to Muslims in the UK. And it weaves together very effortlessly, I might add, British political theory, Western liberal political theory, and Muslim migration history. So in doing so, what it does is it cogently illustrates how Muslims in Britain have actually been at a disadvantage. And one of the main arguments that Khadijah has made in her book is that there is a very tangible equality gap between Muslims and other minority groups and other groups. And one of the main points she has is that British Muslim identity politics has grown and developed around what she has termed an equality gap. And I thought, because this is such a central part of your book, maybe we can talk a bit more about what is this equality gap and how has it been so central in shaping British Muslim political activism.
Yeah, cool. So the idea of the equality gap, really, I developed it as a kind of a tool to really summarize and conceptualize how Muslim activists have sought to represent themselves in the public sphere. So, and this is specifically in terms of making claims to the state and illustrating the legitimacy of their claims, because it's sort of, the onus is often been on them to sort of highlight why the issue that they're making a claim about is deserving of attention and why the state should pay attention to it. And so I think the first sort of big moment that I highlight, I mean, I look at sort of incidents prior to this, but sort of the first sort of big explosive moment was the Rushdie affair. And this was really of 1988 to 9, I think. And the issue around this was, in terms of Muslim representation, was there was a real concerted effort to represent on a united platform a whole range of different communities, geographically, in terms of sort of theological and cultural tendencies, as well as ethnic backgrounds, to the state, the displeasure, the offence that was felt around the publication of the Satanic Verses. And I think what this moment really helped to crystallize for a lot of these Muslim groups, many of which had been functioning prior for the past couple of decades at least, was that they needed to make their claims understandable, accessible, and legible to the state and to the establishment. This wasn't something that many people had really fully grasped before, and I think this moment really illustrated that. And what this meant is that they had to really do some searching about how they represented their concerns. So it wasn't enough to say, as Muslims, we hold the Prophet dear to us, and insulting him is like insulting any one of us, because that's not really an argument that's accessible to people in the public sphere, people who aren't Muslim, or to the state, which would be like, well, okay, and kind of thing. And also
the concept of freedom of expression, which was so central,
which was often sort of pulled out as a sort of red card to these people. Say, well, this trumps everything. There's a whole debate to be had about that as well, and how freedom of expression is sort of weaponized in moments like this. But yeah, absolutely. They had to sort of really take into account that. Yeah, again, thinking about a lot of the sort of the wider context around a lot of these people coming from immigrant backgrounds, and the difficulties and the racism and the structural barriers they're facing. The onus again was very much placed on them to show, okay, we understand this value, we understand this enlightenment value, this Western value of freedom of expression. They had to really highlight that and show that they weren't backward and that they weren't they're lacking in civility or whatever other charges were sort of put forward against them. So this moment was really the first time that these claims, and in this case, the request to initially the request to ban the book, but also it sort of developed into a request to sort of extend blasphemy legislation to cover Muslims and to afford Muslims protection against discrimination, in the same way that a couple of other religious groups, namely Jews and Sikhs, enjoyed. So the equality gap really summarizes this conundrum and how people sort of struggled and really tried to make their claims accessible and understandable in terms of the legal framework. And so what I utilize here is this idea of recognition. So we have minorities who, there are specific features within these minority communities and that are constitutive of themselves and their communities that that aren't catered for or aren't equal or sort of aren't even-handedly dealt with by a supposedly a state that should be neutral, but it's not for various reasons, including in the UK, that our background political culture has evolved out of the Church of England. So the equality gap really looks at that, and through the book I kind of trace how that evolves and how various crisis moments or issues that Muslim representative groups have faced over the years have caused them to sort of reassess themselves and reassess their claims towards the state and repackage them, I suppose, and present them in different ways. But always around this notion that, you know, there is a gap in the way that equality is delivered towards our communities in the UK, and this is how we Muslims experience this gap. And so I wind up towards the end of the book really examining this gap again and questioning whether, in particular during the new Labour years, when there was a lot of legislation around religious discrimination, or significant legislation around religious discrimination, but also around counterterrorism that was introduced that affected Muslim communities in particular, has this gap been narrowed? If so, how? Have other areas where there's a gap been opened up or been sort of laid bare for us to see? And so it's an ongoing it's a concept that we can continue to use, I think, even if what it encompasses shifts and changes a little bit.
Definitely. And one of the things which I found very fascinating was the comparison with the British Jews. I mean, their history and how they differ, the similarities and differences were very, very interesting. And it opens up a whole new lens to view British Muslim political activism as well. So one of the things that you described, and how in the 18th century, after years of persecution and forced exile, when the Jews actually arrived in Britain, it was far more of they took a far more integrationist approach. Whereas British Muslims, or Muslims who arrived mainly from South Asia, it was more of a preservationist approach. The myth of return has been documented. So that difference in arrival and the mindset played a role in laying the foundations, which was interesting. But other South Asian religions like Sikhs and Hindus, they also must have come with a preservationist approach. But even then, one of the things that your book highlights is how even with Sikhs and Hindus and other religions, there's something very specific about Islam and Muslims where we're continuously falling into, like what you say, a gap, into these loopholes where we're not protected, even though race relations have evolved, even though legislations have evolved. There's still some equality gaps where Muslims still are falling into, and we still are being disadvantaged. And so as Muslims, we have to use identity politics, and we have to organize as Muslims and say that this is an equality gap that we are experiencing. Is that
yeah, I think I feel like it's not really for me to say that Muslims have to do anything in particular, or that Muslim representative groups should, I can obviously give my opinion on what I feel is an effective strategy, but I think it's I mean, it should be no surprise to anybody that people continue to organise with their faith on their sleeve, as it will, because they are being, they face structural barriers on the basis of their faith, and they face structural discrimination on the basis of their faith. And so,
because this could be a legitimate question of why are you guys organising around faith? Why not about just
and it is a question that the right wing constantly pose to Muslims, that you've got this obsession. And not just Muslims, we've seen with sort of Black Lives Matter, the retort that all lives matter. It's why are people even having to say this? It's because they're being victimized on the basis of an aspect of their identity, whether it's racialization, whether it's faith identity, or conflation or intersection of both. I think we shouldn't be asking that question of Muslims. Why are you organizing as Muslims? We should be asking, why is society,
why do we have to
continuing continuing to discriminate or perpetuate prejudice against these communities?
So moving on to another aspect of your book, one of the main organizations you focus on is the MCB, the Muslim Council of Britain. And you situate the establishment of the MCB in 1997 as this major turning point in British Muslim political activism. And you discuss this also in the Maidan article about the difficulties of prevent and securitization and the counter-extremism agenda that MCB and also other organizations face. And they're in between, as you describe, these two places where the government only will interact with them if they give unconditional support to their policies. But at the same time, if they do that, then they lose the grassroots support with British Muslims. And how have organizations, particularly MCB, how have they navigated this problem?
Yeah, I think it's a story of ups and downs, I think, and peaks and troughs. I think there have been different moments where they've, and I think that's also understandable, because this is an organization with elected leadership every couple of years. They have, different personalities come and go. Some people stay, some people go, and, the priorities change. The organizations that are affiliated to them also change in terms of their influence and their interest. So that's completely understandable. But it's also one of the, I think, again, it's the nature of the fact that a lot of these groups are voluntary, and it does mean that maybe that comes at the cost of consistency, I suppose, in terms of policy. So how have they navigated it? I mean, there's a moment around for instance, the Iraq War, where there was a very visible sort of dilemma that played out very publicly around the MCB sort of really umming and ahhing over whether they should come out against the war in the way that so many of their affiliates, including the sort of central, the largest affiliates, wanted them to, but also having really just, there was sort of a stage where they, after many years of investment and really sort of intense effort, they'd reached a position where they were having regular meetings with, with the governing party, with New Labour, with cabinet ministers. They had a really great relationship with them, with the civil service, and they felt that they stood to lose all of this. And so it was quite a public dilemma, and it led to them really taking a while to make this decision during such an urgent moment. But eventually they did take that decision to publicly oppose the war, and that really quite, in a very big way affected their relationship with the state. So that's one moment, I think, that was quite publicly sort of played out. But there have been many others. There was another one in 2008 where they were effectively shut out by the government because of the actions of one of their leading office bearers. But most recently, since the Conservatives have come in, or since the coalition government came in fact, in 2010, they have no formal relations with the government. And so this is an organization that was set up specifically with the aim of a place on the table with the government, representing Muslim communities to the government, in the same way to the way that the Board of Deputies of British Jews does. And that was something that was, very out in the open. People knew this, and people in the MCB were very open about it. The government was very open about it. So the idea was that it would be a sort of a counterpart organization to the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which has been around for a lot longer. and is pretty much establishment for its flaws and criticisms that it faces from within its own communities. But the MCB has not been able to do that for various reasons, and one of them is that the government just won't entertain them now. And so it's quite an interesting situation to be in, because it's like their whole purpose of existence, they're not able to fulfill that despite them knocking on various doors. And what they've done in reaction to this is really turned inwardly in a very big way, which has been, again, it's fruitful in many ways. And so by doing so, they've really focused a lot on capacity building within Muslim communities and really working on dilemmas, things around access to places of worship for women and young people, for people with sort of differing abilities. They focused on sort of leadership development programs for young people. And if you trace, I mean, one thing that I always highlight is if you trace the composition of the MCB's leadership cohorts over the year, you'll see that it's gradually become a lot more inclusive in terms of not just sort of gender representation, but also sectarian differences, political leanings, geographical representation. And if you compare that to the sort of very early old guard, which was very London-centric, very sort of middle-aged or elderly, even male, from one ethnicity, from specific political leanings, there's been a whole journey there. And I think one reason for that is that they've been forced to really focus on these aspects, on sort of really on themselves as a structure and how they've sort of represented their communities. They haven't been sort of captivated by the very fast pace of sort of constantly liaising with government on the government's own terms. So in a way, it's been a blessing in disguise for them, I think.
Yeah. So speaking of blessing in disguise, one of the arguments in the literature on Islamism more broadly, so principal Islamic movements more broadly, is that it's called the inclusion moderation argument. I'm sure you've heard of it, where if you include more politically active groups inside the state structure, that actually has a moderating effect. And what's interesting with what you were just saying, it sounds like it's the exclusion moderation, what we're possibly seeing as well. Because the argument goes, in Muslim majority countries, if you exclude them, then the only recourse they have is through violence.
Yes.
Or through very radical politics. Whereas if you include them in the system, it has a much more moderating effect. And there are some people who go against this narrative, but this is one of the dominant narratives. And from sometimes what you're saying, it could be a bit controversial to say this, but do you think that there is a way of being excluded in this way has actually helped in other ways, just like you said, a blessing in disguise with being much more inclusive, especially with women, opening up in terms of sectarian groups, and so in one way it's helped in some areas?
I think it's a slightly different situation in the sense that Muslims, I mean, it's not quite the same as in Muslim majority countries. So Muslims here are minorities, and they're not. So I wouldn't necessarily directly say this, but I think that the general idea that them being excluded has led to a refocusing and a recalibration of priorities. You can definitely say that. To say that they've become moderate makes us assume, I suppose, it's based on the assumption that they were extreme or they were super radical before. And again, that's something I take issue with, because I don't think that's a fair representation. Again, the MCB as well, I think we should be careful not to talk about them as a sort of cohesive whole, when at the end of the day, what it is what they call a consensus organization. It's something that so many, I think they have 500 odd affiliates. These are a whole range of people attach themselves to the MCB, and there's no way of really saying, well, this is definitively what this organization is like, because it's actually a composite of a whole range of different voices. And I think that's actually one of the problems of this model. It has roots in, I mean, we could talk about this, I don't want to take up too long of the session, but I mean, it has roots in a colonial model of governing, really, that, we only want to speak to one representative, excuse me. We can't be dealing with this sort of riffraff of all these different voices. How dare you sort of differ among yourselves? you should all be
Yeah.
sort of speaking the same language so we can understand you, kind of thing. So so yeah, that is a problem around it. But I think for sure this sort of exclusion from the political table has led to a serious reassessment and recalibration. Yes.
That's interesting that you mentioned about how the MCB is not cohesive. And I think we can say that about a lot of Muslim organizations. And this is one of the problems in the literature and the studies of British Muslims, is that actually internally there's a lot of differences and a lot of debates and arguments that are happening. And to speak of cohesive groups, it just doesn't exist.
No, and it's not fair.
So,
it does a disservice. Yeah, absolutely.
So we've actually got one question. So we are opening up questions. So anybody who would like to ask a question to Khadijah, please write it in the chat group. So we have one question from Ahmed. Do you think identity politics is the way forward? Is that not self-victimization? So talking about identity politics and why it's important for, why is it not self-victimization?
Okay, so I would reframe that slightly, and I would say we don't have a right to say what is the way forward or what isn't, or at least I certainly don't. It's not my place to say that, and I think I would reiterate that I definitely it's no surprise, and I would, you know, it's something that actually you know, I wouldn't point any finger of blame on Muslim organizations or Muslim activists for engaging politically on the basis of their faith, because they experience prejudices and challenges specifically, you know, that are Islamophobic, and so it's not for us to. I mean, I would reverse that. Victimization, yeah, this is an argument that you know, that's constantly brought up, and again, I mean, I have a little bit of sympathy with, and I think there is a danger of people sort of constantly focusing on victimhood to the exclusion of things like capacity building. But I think a lot of it is to do with, yeah, I think it's a difficult one. I think more often than not, what it is actually, it's a disingenuous argument where sort of people who are feeling threatened by sort of vocal Muslim activism, because it sort of rocks the establishment boat in one way or another, in particular people from the right wing, particular people in our current government, I would say, will use this to sort of seek to silence people, or seek to cause people to moderate what they have to say. And I think in response to this, we should question, why are there certain norms in the way that we conduct our own politics? What's the basis of them? Are they set in stone? Why do we have to accept them as they are? Do they reflect the reality of the diversity of the UK that we currently live in? I think we have to be more reflective about that and ask these deeper questions of ourselves. So I think Muslims should guard against this victimhood narrative, as should we all. But I think we've got to be careful about using that term as well, because it can be, it is often disingenuously misused in the political arena.
And also, I think one of the points that you discuss in the latter part of your book is how things are changing now. So even though they're still organized around faith, there's a lot more organization around using a more of a human rights framework.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And also aligning, and aligning with other non-Muslim groups around other social justice issues. So I think there's been a shift.
Yeah, I think there is, especially with younger generations, there's been a lot of impatience with the pace of change within communal organizations. And so I will defend the right of Muslim organizations to organize as Muslim, but at the same time, I'm very critical of sort of the sluggish pace of change within them in terms of transparency and sort of inclusivity, and just generally sort of procedural consistency. And so there are a lot of issues around this. And I think a lot of younger Muslims just don't have the interest to sort of continuously campaign or push for change the way they want to see it in these organizations. And so they've actually taken to sort of organizing on other platforms, often with with broad-based coalitions and connections and networks. But quite interestingly, still, I think a lot of these activists still would consider themselves to be Muslim activists, and so they would still be very proud of their faith and foreground that. So I think there might be some other analysts who would say, well, actually, so they're doing this, and their faith is receding in terms of its importance. I haven't really seen that. I think faith still remains very central to these people's identities and the way they are motivated. A lot of people justify what they're doing, their interest in whether it's like climate change or anti-racism or whatever it is they're interested in, or anti-austerity. They will underpin that with religious teachings and heritage, even if they are organizing outside of conventional Muslim organizations.
But do you think they'll articulate it in a more secular human rights framework? Even
I think there is a bit of that. Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's very difficult to generalize, but yeah, that is something that I've seen for sure. Yeah.
So we have another question from Mustafa. How do you think Prevent will shape under the Munira Mirza and Boris Johnson government?
Oh wow, Munira Mirza and Boris Johnson government. I like this. So Munira's just oh gosh. So she's I'm trying to remember now. She was appointed to is it the, I don't want to get this wrong. What was the committee she was appointed to recently? You
can just talk about Prevent under Boris, under the.
Was it the Islamophobia review? Yeah, okay, sure. Prevent under Boris, and Munira, regardless of the role she's been given, I think one of the issues around it is that she's on record for basically denying that there's such a thing as structural racism, and that Islamophobia is not an issue for us to be worried about. And again, this victimhood narrative, she's a prime example of somebody who will constantly sort of pull that out and say, well, you guys are just moaning and wanting special treatment. So the question was around Prevent under Boris. I think what we've seen already is that it's constantly being ratcheted up. And this is something that's, the Conservative governments, year on year, they've been, and Labour before them actually, have been introducing new, more stringent legislation around Prevent and Securitisation. And I think one of the things that I am particularly concerned about, and which I alluded to, or I spoke about at length, in fact, in the article that you mentioned, was around how this is the idea of the welding of the idea of what's referred to as fundamental British values, the utilisation of this to signify what a good or bad citizen looks like, what a patriotic and loyal citizen looks like, but therefore what a non-patriotic or subversive citizen looks like. How this has come under the purview of Prevent, and how it's being used to signal which Muslim groups are acceptable for the government to engage with and which aren't. And so what the government's taken to doing, and actually again it's not without precedent, the precedent goes way back into the 1990s onto Tony Blair, but I think it's become more intense at the moment, is to name Muslim organizations and name Muslim individuals and say, these are people who are anathema to our British values that we ourselves define. And therefore what this has done is that Muslim organizations and activists have been forced into a space where they have to police themselves, because they know that these individuals that have been named become something of a poison chalice. So if we come near them, if we touch them, if we engage with them, we share a platform with them, that's it. We can forget about anybody taking us seriously in the establishment or in the public domain. So I think this is something that, from an activism perspective, there are lots of other areas that Prevent has touched and I think are very concerning. One of them includes the idea of astroturfing, the idea of sort of setting up pseudo civil society organizations as a way of sort of keeping an eye on what's going on, or sort of gathering data or whatever else it is that the state is interested in. That's another
unbelievable area. I don't know how you feel about this, but it's quite shocking actually how you will find websites and which they seem like they're grassroots Muslim initiatives.
Absolutely.
But then we find out through maybe leaked documents that they're privately funded. And one of the things you talk about in, I think, the preface of the book about social engineering hashtags, and how the government actually is really taking an interest in grassroots organizations and maybe through the back door trying to infiltrate and influence opinion.
Yeah, I
which
mean,
is
there's
quite
this
quite
fascinating
frightening.
example
Yeah.
of sort of rapid response sort of groups that after certain terrorist attacks have sort of activated certain hashtags around, you know, Islam means peace or whatever it is, or set up sort of stunts where people will sort of line Waterloo Bridge holding roses that have hadiths attached to them, you know, and this is all something that's orchestrated from within RICU, which is an arm of the Home Office. So it's really fascinating because it does present itself as an authentic, spontaneous response when actually it's something that's sort of just pre-planned but just actioned whenever something like this happens, and it's really very eerie, and you wonder, you know, what extent it impacts on how, you know, I think about particularly young Muslims who grow up and this is all they've known. It must be, you know, I've got a memory of something that, you know, used to, you know, what the world was like before that, but I do wonder how psychologically it can have quite serious impacts. But
it's like people saying we're in the post-truth world, you know,
right.
and it's, you really feel, when you start reading into this, you really do feel like that at times.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it sort of in terms of eroding trust. I mean, I think people talk about, you know, how we can work on, you know, young people, not just Muslims. I think minorities, in terms of, you know, how we can work on their trust, increasing trust between them and between various state institutions. And you think, well, okay, there are reasons why this trust is weak and eroded. So. Yeah, I was going to say something else, but it's gone. It comes back to me.
Never mind. It'll come back. Okay, so a question from Amina. Do you think the MCB model is flawed and the Jewish deputy model is better?
I wouldn't. Yeah, I would find it difficult to sort of come down either way. They are ultimately quite different, and they have very different histories. So I would say the idea of the state expecting a religious community to have a sort of unified or cohesive voice that's represented by a handful of people that they can converse with at will. This whole idea is problematic, but I think there are the failure of the MCB to have to continue to have longevity and at the sort of the main table of politics is not so much their fault as it is the fault of hostile forces from within the government, from within the media, from within politics and policy, people who haven't wanted it to succeed. And so it has its many flaws, absolutely, and continues to. And I think it's weighed down by the fact that it seeks to constantly carry this consensus, which at the end of the day is impossible. It's weighed down by a lot of other factors, but I think it's I think there's the one thing which I really sort of want to underline is that if we want to talk about fairness and even-handedness, we cannot have what I call a sort of differential model of engagement between the state and its different the minority communities. And so if the state is engaging with the Board of Deputies and pretty much affording it an establishment position, it cannot shut out other consensus or umbrella organizations. It can't do that. It hasn't got the right to do that, because then it's treating different organizations differently, different communities differently. It's not listening to them in the same way. And so one thing I highlight in the book, I talk about how the state subsidizes or funds security measures in places of worship in various faith communities. Now, the way that it does that, I do a comparison between the Jewish community and the Muslim community. The way that it does that in Jewish communities, for example, is there's been 2 or 3 moments where cabinet ministers have committed at public sort of engagements with the Jewish community, like annual dinners or big moments like this, and reassured them several times that they will continue to have blanket funding from the state up to a certain amount, but it pretty much covers all their needs, to fund security, not just security equipment, but security personnel and other measures in all their institutions. And by that, I mean not just synagogues, but things like communal spaces, schools, other identifiably communal spaces within the Jewish community. And not only this, but this is administered independently through something called the Community Security Trust, which is an organization, a community organization in the Jewish community that looks at security, basically. Now, if you contrast that with the way that Muslims have access to funding for security, again, they're both religious communities that face significant hate and prejudice and attack in our society. Now, Muslims are not given the same assurance at all. Muslim communities or mosques actually specifically are the only ones that can bid for funding, and that is specifically for security equipment, not personnel. It's restricted, and it's only to a certain amount, and they are bidding in the context of all other faiths as well. So there's a sort of competition going on. They've got to establish that they need it more than other people. So this is just one example of very sort of differential engagement that we've had between both communities. Again, the conversation with the Jewish community happens very much with the Board of Deputies of British Jews. With Muslims, it's like whoever is in and out of favour with the state. A more recent example that one of my colleagues has raised has been around engagement around the reopening of places of worship in the wake of COVID. Engagement from the state with Jewish communities has been much broader, much more intense, and has included activists from a whole range of spectrums, from a huge spectrum. Whereas within the Muslim community, it's only been with a handful of 2 or 3 very predictable names, people who are already on board with government policy. And so it's very clear that there is this differential form of engagement. And I think this is what I would attribute the failure of the MCB to continue to influence policy in a serious way too.
Also, you mentioned how in the Race Relations Act, Jews are protected in the Race Relations Act, Jews and Sikhs, right. Whereas Muslims are not. So this is another point where there's differential treatment.
Yeah, I mean, this was much more serious.
In an inadvertent way, yeah.
Yeah, I think this was much more serious when the MCB was being set up. It was much more clear, and the disparity and that gap was much more pronounced. I think now with a lot of further legislation having been introduced, and the standardisation through equalities legislation and the EHRC, I think that's less of an issue. I think Muslims do have access to religious discrimination. I mean, there are flaws within those laws as well. There have been criticisms within of the way that the EHRC conducts itself, and in particular its approach towards Islamophobia. So it's not without its issues, but yeah, for sure.
Another question, do you think there's a generational difference in the mobilization of British Muslims? So the younger generations engaging through religious identity and the older generations engaging through their ethnic identity? Right.
I think this is interesting because we're now at a stage where we're like at 3rd, 4th generation. So I mean, older generation, who do we mean by that? And, so I think...
Or do you see generational differences?
There are, for sure, generational differences. And I think that's reflective of the direction that society is going into, and the platforms that people have access to in terms of organising, and the issues and the sort of the priorities that people have in society. I think if we look at sort of the early immigrant communities, yes, there was more organising on the basis of ethnicity, and there was a moment where, particularly in the 1970s, where a lot of Muslim activists were very much involved in anti-racist struggles with people from other ethnic minorities, organising on a sort of secular basis, really, not without being very upfront about their faith necessarily. And I think the Rushdie Affair played a role in encouraging people to organise on the basis of their faith. That's not to say people didn't organise on the basis of their faith prior to that, but I think it really sort of brought that into the spotlight and accentuated it a lot, in particular on a national level, which is the focus of my study, national level organising. I think locally, that there are lots of variations there. I think with the sort of young people today, again, there are even more, again, there's further differences in the way that people, I think probably more complex ways that people express themselves. and not just sort of ethnic and religious identities, but there's a lot of other aspects of people's identity that people choose to foreground as well. And I think there's more of a, I think prior to that, in the sort of past couple of generations, there might have been more of an impulse to sort of simplify somebody's identity and say, well, you know, I'm primarily Muslim and that's the main thing I'm going to be talking about. Whereas now there's more of a drive for appreciating nuance, and there's more actually, even this is a sort of a side point, but within activist organizations, people are much more relaxed, or not fully, but I think much more comfortable with the idea of diversity within them. I think, you know, maybe a couple of decades ago, there might have been this impulse to really present a unified voice and, you know, this is the Muslim view, this is the Muslim opinion, or the Muslim take on this issue, or whatever. Whereas now there's much more of a sort of, people have become, I guess, much more comfortable with acknowledging diversity and not feeling threatened or disturbed about it. And again, to come back to the MCB, we've seen the way that that has played out in their own discourse and the way that they talk about themselves. So just a very small example, when they first set up, their claim was that they are the representative organization of Muslims, and you know they have more rights than anybody else to speak about Islam and Muslims. Whereas now it's much more understated the way they talk about themselves. They're much more they recognize much more that there is a landscape out there and that they just form part of that. There's been sort of a humbling of their discourse. Potentially, again, that has been influenced by the way they've been shut out by the state as well.
Also, I think amongst British Muslims, I think now we don't talk about ourselves as one group. Especially recently with Black Lives Matter and Black Muslims coming out saying we have very different experiences, and so even amongst British Muslims there's this understanding that actually there are various layers within ourselves.
Absolutely,
as well.
and there is discomfort in those conversations because some people are taken aback and they think, well, you know, I didn't even think about that, I don't even know, or some people are in denial about it, right? So there is a tension and discomfort in those conversations, but those conversations are happening, which is
So there's somebody, Sabah, who wanted to ask a question directly on Zoom. So Mizan, would you like to unmute her? Or Sabah, you can unmute yourself and ask.
You've already asked my question, the generational difference. That was my question. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much, Sabah. Okay, we have another question from Molly. Isn't the problem to do with Muslims as a faith group not recognized in English law as opposed to Jewish or Sikh, perhaps as a race? I think we've discussed this issue of race, and you said how it's developed since then.
Yes,
but that was the issue in the beginning.
Okay.
And we've got another question. What do you think of the new think tank set up recently, the Centre for Muslim Policy Research, with Sajjad Karim and Muhammad Amin as advisors? They're seen as very Tory-led.
Yeah, I mean, there's not really much for me to go by except for what they put out on their website, which is very basic, but I mean, I think they put out a few personalities that are involved, and yes, it does seem to be Tory-led. It does seem to be motivated by a right-leaning agenda. So, I mean, I'll be following it with interest. In particular, I'll be interested in the stream that they have on counter-extremism. I'll be interested to see what the arguments are there. I was quite interested in the fact that their research lead was somebody who has associations with the Henry Jackson Society, which is a neoconservative, documented Islamophobic outfit. So that was not something that engendered a huge amount of trust in me. But you know, I'll be following them with great interest.
Okay. Another question about again about leadership. So in British Muslim civil society, there's been a hegemony or dominance of quite a narrow demographic, mainly South Asian male and elders, which has been the case at the grassroots and higher up in Muslim civil society all throughout the UK. So particularly outside London and until recently within London too. So I guess the question is, are the demographics changing? I think you've touched upon this, especially how in the MCB the demographics are shifting. Yeah,
I would say that there has been change.
And they're actively doing this, right?
Yes, I think there is an active concern. I mean, I think they've done things where, for instance, they've, you know, that we can criticize this. I mean, there are pros and cons to it, but they've implemented a quota around female representation in their national committee. And that did, yeah, if I look back, I mean, I think it was implemented first in 2014, so it's been 6 years. There has been a significant shift in terms of female representation. There is a concern around that, as with any sort of form of affirmative action or positive discrimination, that people that you end up filling spaces with people who might not necessarily, you know, are there specifically because of that feature. And I wouldn't want to presume that, of course, of anybody there, but I think it's something that obviously does cross people's minds, that, you know, how effective is this genuinely in rooting out the issue of lack of representation? Are they still the same voices that are being heard? But I think even if you look at the sort of office bearers, there is a diversity there in terms of gender representation and ethnic background and religious sort of, you know, we've got Sunni Shia individuals. These were things that would have been unheard of for sure in the founding days of the Muslim Council of Britain. In terms of local, I agree there's a lot of variation in terms of local politics and local leadership, and it's impossible to generalize about that, but there are definitely areas that are more dominated by one group than others. I think sometimes that reflects the composition of actually communities, which goes back to settlement. And so when you look at the sort of settlement of pioneer immigrants among our communities, often it was a case that people lived close to relatives or cousins or people they knew. And so there are areas where there is a huge concentration of, you know, one ethnic background. And so I mean, it would be no surprise then that, you know, their local mosque or their local organization is composed primarily of people from those backgrounds. But I think it's conversation, and I think it's a conversation that's being had in earnest in many spaces, which I think is only a positive thing. You know, the idea of representation, and I think that the issue of, you know, the related issue of access to mosques for women and young people, which I think is a very urgent but also very thorny issue that I think a lot of people are sort of concerned around touching, really. And I think it's one thing that I would encourage in my conversations with people. I always say, well, you know, we have no choice but to tackle it very emphatically, and it's our communities are you know, stand to lose basically the longer it's left.
Another question about outside external influence, mainly from Saudi or UAE, maybe with tacit support from the UK government. Did you find any evidence of this?
That's not something I really looked into, I'll be honest. Funding and that kind of thing. I mean, I was it
would be difficult to research.
Yeah, it wasn't I mean, it crops up, of course, because there has been sustained funding, and I think it crops up in particular in discussions around counter-extremism. So things like there have been several sort of expose documentaries around going undercover into mosque spaces and looking through literature that's come from Saudi Arabia, for instance, and looking through sort of unpalatable material in there and asking, why is that still being allowed in our mosques? So these are things that I've looked at and how that's impacted activism and organizations. But yeah, sort of any deeper than that, it's not something that I feel qualified to comment about.
I mean, they're quite covert, these funding kind of streams, and quite often, more often than not, they're exaggerated. So yeah, external influence. Okay. And is there anything that can be said about Muslim female activists and the role, if any, they play in Muslim representative groups?
Yeah, I think the role of female activists, we shouldn't, in considering it, we shouldn't limit it to Muslim representative groups. There have been many hurdles that female activists have faced in terms of finding a voice in these groups. Often, you know, in the origins of these groups have been exclusively male, and involvement from females has often been very nominal, box ticking. So like I say, it's changed a lot, and increasingly we are seeing female leaders finding their space there. We're nowhere near a situation that I would say is as reflective of the actual activism that Muslim women do. So a lot of Muslim women invest huge amounts in their communities through activism that isn't recognized, and that doesn't seek the limelight, that doesn't receive the limelight in many ways, and whether it's through sort of actually just running the show in a mosque, basically, even though they're not recognized in any way. And you know, there's a sort of an official committee that doesn't include them in any way, but that's the committee that sort of people see and hear about. But actually, the person running the show is often a woman in many mosques I've seen, and that's the person who sort of day in day out does the bread and butter and gets their hands dirty, or whether it's, you know, people who organize you know, things like political activism, fundraising, you know, grassroots sort of organizing against the impacts of securitization, for instance, in local communities, or even things like educational projects. There's this, you know, I wouldn't say there's a discrete area that Muslim women, I think sometimes we get this impression that like this is the women's space and this is the women's section, these are women's concerns. I don't think there is any of that at all, actually. I think that's a misrepresentation. I think women have always been very deeply involved in community affairs and activism. It's just whether we see it or whether we want to see it, whether we want to project it. That's the problem.
I think this is one of the difficulties as researchers as well, because they're doing work which is not in the limelight. It's very difficult to document and highlight it.
Yes,
and
yeah, because it doesn't make it into the, sort of the minutes, yeah, or the newsletter, or whatever it is that you're looking at.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Another question, how do we as Muslims become more effective in influencing policy and engaging with the government, which does not want to do with MCB and others? So basically, how can we be more influential in policy with a government that doesn't want to engage with groups such as the MCB?
Yeah, this is it's an interesting question.
That's the $1 million question, I think.
Yeah, and I don't think there's a single answer either.
Yeah.
So there isn't a single answer to that. There are many ways that people can seek to influence. I think the first question you want to ask yourself is, I mean, I think it's great that people, you know, it's our, you know, we all have every right to seek influence in the political affairs of our country. And you know, I'm not asking this question of why to make you doubt yourself, but ask yourself why you want to seek influence, what it is you want to achieve, what it is that what impact do you want to make, I think, and that will help sort of then define maybe what the most appropriate route for that is. So for instance, if you're bothered or if you're disturbed about securitization, for instance, I wouldn't necessarily say getting onto any official committee is going to be the best way to deal with that, because firstly, you know, I mean, these spaces are notorious for sort of cherry picking yes men, basically people who sort of agree with the direction that things are going in. So it's unlikely that you'll be afforded that space if you're a critical voice in the first place, right? But there are plenty of ways to organize from the outside of that, whether it's exposing or drawing it to attention, inconsistencies or sort of oppressive policy. So that's sort of one route that you would perhaps want to consider. Yeah, I mean, there are other areas that you might want to sort of to impact or influence direction of policy. If you want to look at sort of, for instance, education, there are various ways that you can think about that, whether it's in your local area or it's on a national level. So yeah, it's difficult to give a sort of a short answer to that, but I think your first step would be to ask, well, what area is that I want to influence? What do I have to give? What is it that I can, what difference do I want to see here? And then take it from there.
Question from Yahya, but on a directly. Dr. Hira, can I just unmute him?
Yeah. Yes, I was just about to say that to you.
Hello, assalamu alaikum. So I'm calling from Roundhay Park in Leeds.
Nice.
Sorry I'm joining you late. So I hope this question isn't repetitive or irrelevant, but it seems to me that the major divide in the British Muslim activist scene is on the issue of prevent. So whether somebody is pro-prevent or anti-prevent, it seems to cut across a lot of traditional divisions that existed in the past, and has sort of reformatted. It's kind of become the major new cleavage. What do you think are the present and possibly future consequences of this division? And you know, how do you see it playing out?
Okay, thanks for the question. I think what policies like prevent necessarily do is that they delineate the good guys from the bad guys from the perspective of the state. And I think that's something that we've seen right now. And you know, I talked earlier about how by naming people who are supposedly beyond the pale, or by naming what sort of what fundamental British values should look like from the state's perspective. So both of those, what the state's doing is telling us, okay, this is the good side and this is the bad side. If you're on the bad side, you'll be penalized in this way. And if you're on the good side, don't you dare engage with the bad side, because you'll also have to sort of bear the consequences. And I think that's definitely something that we're seeing in the way that Muslim organizations and activists relate to one another. They're being forced to sort of function within this landscape, and that includes really sort of moderating themselves and policing themselves and thinking once, twice, and 3 times about how they relate to one another. I think that's something that I'm most concerned about personally, because it can have really long-lasting consequences, I think, as you suggest. I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm not saying I have any answers either, but I just it's worth discussing, because there's always a sort of ethics around whether you sometimes ignore this division in order to get other kinds of work done, and this is one of the reasons why it becomes so fraught.
I think some people have suggested that to me in conversations, that, you know, okay, there are other things we can talk about, but the problem with this is that prevent and the securitization agenda in general has become so has infiltrated into so many aspects of people's lives that it's very difficult to put it aside and say, you know, we're not going to talk about this for now, we'll talk about other things, because it's actually come into so many other things. It's come into education, it's come into health, it's come into sort of things like housing, it's come into sort of even theology. Right, so
yeah, of course, that's the problem. It's not just local state functions, but even community functions of religious leadership, and you know, religious institutions and how they're regulated and how they can be trained. There's so many things. So I mean, it's really difficult. It's a really difficult area, because, you know, at the one level you want to keep the conversation open to try and debate it, but it seems like the spaces to debate it, frankly, have closed, if you see what I mean. So instead, that's been replaced by sort of ethic of mutual demonization, rather than heart to heart. So it's a sort of like some of the people who I vehemently disagree with, who I used to get on with on a personal level, I now can't sit down, even have a rational, normal public debate with them without it descending into a bun fight, which is a shame, because we can't actually exchange views anymore. You see what I mean? I don't even sort of have a chance to persuade people, if that makes sense. And that's
does make sense.
That's frustrating to me. How do we get over that hurdle? It seems that there's a sort of a vested interest now. They don't want that status quo to change. What they want to do is to push out independent Muslim community organizing through demonization. And that's really a zero-sum game. That means that it's just going to continue to be a bun fight, basically. There's no sort of reasonable way out of it, as far as I can see. We'll have to go through it the hard way, unfortunately. I don't know if you agree with that. I see it's just going to be a struggle. I don't see anything else.
I do agree, actually. I think it's really disappointing, and I think it's quite characteristic of, I think, the approach that this current government has. I think with many things, it's sort of railroading things, that if something doesn't, you know, it's a mess, but we'll still keep pushing at it, kind of thing, and it achieves what they want at the end of the day, which is to sort of you know, they've surrounded themselves with a few names and a few voices that will sort of agree with their approach, but at the expense of well, I think what's been sacrificed there is cohesive conversation within our communities, and openness and growth, and the growth that comes with that. That's not happening. That's being suffocated. And you know, people are feeling that, as you say, there is this air of sort of toxic suspicion that people have between activist groups, constantly sort of guessing why people said what they said, and they must have an agenda, they must have a reason why they said it. Oh, okay, well, I'm not going to talk to them because of this or that, and that is really toxic. And I think the longer it stays like this, the harder it is going to be to undo.
I think it's become calcified, hasn't it? That's the whole problem.
Right.
It's become a career. It's become a choice. It's become a lifestyle almost. You know.
And for many people, absolutely, and a career in the very sort of, you know, conventional sense of the word, right? So
I don't know. Anyway, sorry, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yahya, for your question. And we have one last question from Umar, who would like to directly ask as well. Mizan, if you can unmute Umar, please.
Yeah. Oh, Omar, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum, Khadijah. I hope you can hear me.
I can.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you for your insights. In terms of the influence of, let's say, government and so forth, I think any government would take its approach in terms of utilizing people, being polemic as they wish. But in terms of the Muslims, do you not feel that if we latched on to things that are greater, let's say, not just Muslim-centric, but beyond us, and actually fronted and advocated in those areas, that would make us powerful? And also, a second question, in terms of, I was in the civil service for quite a while as a government lawyer and so forth, and I have some experience in there. Do you feel that if there were more Muslims within the power structures of the state, as it were, that would change things a little? And what stops people like, let's say, your generation? Let's say, if I consider my generation to be, you know, in the older generation, what stops the younger generation going into these power structures, as it were, to influence them from the Muslim community?
Okay. I think on your first question, I think I would question what you mean by Muslims having power. I don't know if this is something that, I mean, for some people this might be something that drives them, but I don't know that this is necessarily what drives people.
Power to do good, not power in the sense that they have power. What I mean by power is power to, having the power to influence, let's say, policy, politics, legislation, and so forth. So power not for the sake that they want the power, but power to do good. That's how.
Okay, if you could remind me, sorry, well, if they, you were saying if they, I'm sorry, the first question, what is it that people would do that would afford them greater power to influence?
So to be in the structures of the state. So whether it's politics, government, you know.
I mean, of course, I think, you know, we've seen how Muslims have increasingly over the past few decades become more represented in various avenues of power. And I think it's worth asking the question of, you know, what have we gained from this? I think, you know, we've got to think about representation beyond just sort of numbers and colourful sort of photos or whatever it is. I absolutely wouldn't disparage people who decide to enter politics, whether it's through the elected route or otherwise. I think it's, you know, something that's great and important, and we should celebrate it. But I wouldn't say that's the only avenue for achieving change. And I probably would be on the view, from what I've seen, that it's not necessarily the most effective. And that's because in order to succeed in areas that are often very hostile, and we hear so many stories about hostility that people of color, not just Muslims, face in these spaces, and so many hurdles and prejudices that they face, and because obviously naturally that if you want to sort of progress in such areas, you've got to align yourself to a political party and its agenda. So I wouldn't say that these are necessarily the most effective avenues for affecting change, for achieving change. I think if we look historically at how change has been achieved, often it's actually taking its cue from grassroots movements, radical movements outside of the sort of political establishment, and actually often the political establishment has followed suit when it really has had little choice but to do so.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Umar, for your question, and thank you everybody who posed questions and participated. I'd like to now bring the session to an end. Thank you again, Khadijah, for your time and for your incredible insights, and for Mizan for organizing this session. And again, thank you all for tuning in on a Saturday evening. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much to Dr. Khadijah and Dr. Hira and everyone who contributed. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.